Good morning. It's 8 a.m. here in Seoul. You're watching Arirang News with me, Oh-seung. We're very glad to have you with us for our very first edition of Global Insight, where we connect live with people around the world to provide you with the latest, along with experts' views on issues making headlines. But first, we begin with news. Our top story this morning, South Korea confirmed five more deaths of the COVID-19 deaths overnight, bringing the national death toll from the virus to 22. The number of confirmed cases now stands at 3,736. For more, we connect to our Kim Bo-kyung on the line. Bo-kyung, what's the latest?
Hi, Seung. According to the Daegu city government on Monday, a 77-year-old woman who had been waiting to be hospitalized has died of COVID-19. She went to public health center in Daegu last Friday because she had fever and was confirmed with the virus the next day. This is the fifth death overnight, bringing the death toll to 22 in South Korea as of now. Other four deaths were also in Daegu, all four of them patients in their 80s. Most of them already had underlying pre-existing health conditions such as diabetes or high blood pressure. On Sunday, an additional 586 people were confirmed with COVID-19, bringing the nation's total to 3,736, according to Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Most are concentrated in the southeastern city of Daegu, with over 2,700, and the surrounding Gyeongsang-buk-do province at over 550. A 45-day-old baby has also been infected in Gyeongsang-buk-do province, making the infant the youngest patient in the nation. According to health authorities on Sunday, both the baby and its mother were confirmed on Saturday. The baby's father was confirmed last Thursday, and he's a member of Shincheonji religious group.
Right, and with the rising number of infections here in Korea, an increasing number of countries are restricting the entry of travelers from South Korea. More than 80 countries now, I believe, correct?
Yes, Seung. 81 countries have either banned people coming in from South Korea or enhanced their entry procedures in light of the severity of the coronavirus outbreak here. According to South Korea's foreign ministry, as of 10 p.m. Korea time on Sunday, 36 countries, including Vietnam, Madagascar, and Angola, are banning the entry of travelers who have been to South Korea within the past 14 days. 45 countries, including some African countries such as Nigeria, have strengthened health checks on such travelers or are isolating them upon arrival. 14 provinces in China are also restricting the entry of those traveling from South Korea. The number of countries or regions that are putting these entry restrictions has soared around sixfold compared to last week. That's all from me for now. Back to you.
That was our Kim Bo-kyung. Now, the number of people across the world who have died from the coronavirus has surpassed 3,000. Italy reported 5 more deaths on Sunday, bringing the death toll there to 34. The number of patients rose to 1,694 after Italy revealed 566 new cases the same day. Germany's cases doubled to 129 on Sunday from 66 on Saturday. The Czech Republic has confirmed its first 3 cases, with all the patients having travelled from northern Italy. In the Middle East, the number of cases has soared past 1,000, with Iran alone reporting 979 cases as of Sunday. Iran's death toll also jumped by 11 to 54, the highest number of deaths outside of mainland China. Now, reacting to the growing number of countries imposing entry bans on people from South Korea, Seoul's Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa spoke with her counterpart from the UAE on Sunday, asking the Gulf state to refrain from actions that could disturb bilateral exchanges. The UAE has so far not banned travelers from South Korea. Kang also went on to assure her counterpart that South Korea is doing its best to contain the spread of the virus. Seoul has also lodged a complaint over Vietnam's unannounced ban on incoming flights from South Korea, given the inconveniences that were caused by the unilateral action. An Asiana Airlines flight was turned back on its way to Hanoi on Saturday after authorities there refused to let the plane land. The beginning of March in Korea is a time to remember the nationwide movement for independence that erupted on the 1st of March 101 years ago. It not only triggered further efforts for liberation from Japan's colonization, but also served as an inspiration to other colonized nations. Today, we have Dr. Erez Manella, Professor of History at Harvard University, who is leading world research on the year of 1919 and the string of independence movements seen that year around the world. We also have Dr. Emanuel Pistrich, Director of the Asia Institute here in South Korea. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Now first, Dr. Pistrich,
yes.
I would first like to ask you, what was the context behind the March 1st movement?
Well, it came right after the First World War, in a period where there was tremendous disillusionment with a culture and a economy driven by expansion and war, and an effort from the Paris Peace Conference and the efforts people around Woodrow Wilson to put forth a vision of self-determination and also of humanity coming together as one under the League of Nations. In the specifics of Korea, the Emperor Kojong died, suspected of being assassinated by the Japanese. And the Japanese had, through economic and cultural means, been essentially slowly taking over Korea. So it was an effort both for self-assertion of Korea's own cultural and political independence, but also part of an effort to build a sort of a common movement with humanity around the world.
Right. Now, Dr. Manella, as a historian leading research on 1919, what's unique to you about Korea's Hamil independence movement? What really sets it apart from independence movements that preceded it?
Well, there's a number of different things that set it apart. In the Korean context, I think we can say it was the first national mass movement for Korean independence to erupt on the peninsula, encompassing people from all walks of life, from the educated elites to the common people, men and women, and from different parts of the peninsula. In the global context, it was distinguished by a number of things. One is the fact that it was preceded by a very clear declaration of independence. The stated aims of the protests were put out in a very, very clear fashion, which distinguishes it from many of the other movements. And also, it was the first mass protest movement to erupt in the colonial world after the end of the First World War.
I see. And actually, Korea's independence movement, the Hamil movement rather, it in a way fell domestically at the time, but it also served as a source of inspiration for other colonies around the world. Why do you think that the Korean model of independence really resonated with other countries?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The Japanese authorities tried very hard to prevent news and information both coming into Korea and also going out of Korea. So they really tried to keep the lid on news about the protests, but they failed. And it was widely reported around the world, both the Korean protests and the Japanese suppression efforts of these protests, including in Europe and in North America. And including in other places in the colonial world. So, for example, in China, we know that Chinese nationalists were looking at the Korean example when they were gathering for their own May 4th movement about 2 months later. In India, in Egypt, elsewhere around the world, the news arrived about the Korean uprising and inspired other peoples to gather and revolt as well.
I see. Sorry, we had a minor lag in the connection there. But before we get to you, Dr. Pistrich, I just have one more question for Dr. Manella. So why were Korea's cries for independence largely ignored at the time around the world, despite its many efforts to reach out to other countries?
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting question. So at the level of the publics, there was actually a lot of discussion of the Korean efforts. There was quite a bit of support. Especially among missionaries for example, in North America, Canada, and the United States, for the Korean efforts at independence. But the level of governments, the Japanese just had a lot more power, and Japan had a recognized, had internationally recognized rule over Korea since at least 1910, and the governments of the other powers were simply not interested in angering Japan by showing support for the Korean effort.
Right, and Dr. Prestreich, now the Koreans weren't liberated until 1945, but you said that the influence of the Samin movement, it spread to even Germany. So could you elaborate more on that, please?
Well, I think when we look at the movement, I mean, particularly the declaration, the Independence Declaration by the scholar Che Nam-sun shows a profound degree of sophistication, that there was an emphasis on culture in a sense, and I think this is based in the sort of the tradition, emphasis on universal values in Korea that goes far back in the Chosun dynasty, that it resonated with people, and the degree to which the scholars in Korea and the thoughtful intellectuals involved articulated their vision, both not only for self-determination for the individual ethnic group, but for this vision of humanity coming together as a whole for a greater cause. This inspired, especially in the May 4th movement in China, this idea that we could use culture to offer an alternative to imperialism and exploitation. And it had deep resonance, often not so visible on the surface, throughout the 1920s and 1930s around the world.
Right, and of course, Korea's Samin movement didn't immediately lead to independence, but how did it influence other uprisings and other forces of resistance in the country?
That's me?
Oh, yes, to you, Dr.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, China, as I mentioned, and to some degree India, in the efforts for long-term sort of systematic cultural movements to bring people together as, I guess, issues of identity and agency, created, inspired by the sophisticated arguments made within the independence movement in Korea, had profound impact around the world. And particularly, I think it was not an explicitly anti-Japanese movement and many of the statements made at that period appealed to Japanese sensibility. There was a sense of reason and civilization that was at the core of it. And also in Korea itself, although it was viciously suppressed, it never completely stopped, right? There were meetings that took place informally. There were groups in Manchuria into China who continued their efforts. And although many were put in jail, tortured, put under house arrest, the movement never completely petered out because I think it was not simply a political movement, it was a cultural, civilizational movement.
I see. And Dr. Minella, would there be anything you would like to add to that? What kind of message do you think Korea's independence movement and the others that followed gave our world to people today even?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I completely agree with Professor Pastreich. Although the movement was suppressed in the streets and the countryside of Korea, its cultural impact was felt both on the peninsula and beyond, and also some of the political structures. For example, the provisional government that was put in place at the time in 1919 survived throughout the 20s and 30s, and then, of course, came back in the Second World War and participated, was an important component of the post-World War II arrangements on the Korean peninsula. So that's one impact, I think. The other one, and which is very important, I think, today, is to remember that Koreans, both North and South, participated equally in this movement. The unity of the peninsula was assumed and represented in the movement, and so I think even today it's an event that's recognized and perhaps even celebrated on both parts of the peninsula.
Right. Even 101 years later, it still leaves a message of hope. Well, That's where we're going to have to leave the discussion. Thank you both so much for joining us for our very first edition of Global Insight. Also, thank you to our viewers. We hope to see you with us at the same time tomorrow for more insights from experts around the world. In the meantime, have a lovely day or night wherever you are watching us. Goodbye.